so this isn't really anything important. It's just if you're interested. These are the animations that made the thing fly around. These are linked to in the lesson plan, so if you want to look into them, you're more than welcome to. Let me close this so it's not shining on you. We're probably not going to go over animations in this class, except maybe at the end, and that's because animations are really, really fun, and because they're really, really fun, people have made a lot of really fun tutorials for them, and also made them really easy. So if you want to learn animations in the copious amounts of free time you have, yeah, I would say go for it. They're fun. And then over here, so I'm not going to tell you how long I spent looking for all of the different symbols I could use to make ducks. But I got them all from this page. So these are all of the different HTML special characters that have abbreviations. So like how M dash, you write M dash. Or for trademark, you write trade. So all of the ones that have their own little abbreviation, it's super handy, and I refer to it all the time. So I select out that link if you're interested, but that's that. Okay, so back to user stories. So like I said before, we wrote basically the user stories for a duck. So theoretically, if a user experiences every single one of these things, they have experienced a duck. So it's sort of backwards from what you would think. It's not if a user experiences a duck, then they will also experience these things. It's the other way around. It's saying if a user experiences exactly these things, then they have experienced a duck. So it's sort of doing it in reverse. A user story describes what the user should be able to do. Here's the most important thing about user stories. User stories should not include code. User stories shouldn't include HTML, CSS. They shouldn't include anything relating to code. User stories should not include code. There are code stories. You also might call that pseudocode. But that is pretty different from user stories, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Going along with that, you should always write your user stories before you write your code. So write your user stories before you write code or pseudocode. So those two things, why? Sanjay.
It sort of provides like a rough draft or an outline for your plan of action.
That's true, but I mean, you could say that pseudocode is just a rough draft or an outline for your plan of action, right? So
yeah, well, I guess more specifically for user stories, when someone comes to your application or web page, what they're going to get out of it, and it helps you plan for that.
Mm-hmm. But why is that more important than me just like planning out what my code is? Adrian?
So maybe you don't really know what your code can be, or like the easiest way that you can do it. If your goal is to get the user to, I don't know, like play a certain game or do something, writing it from their perspective first, when you don't know where to start, lets you kind of look at what kind of code you might need in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. Wayne?
I was going to say, it can help you make your code more drawing. So you were saying before, like when you do user stories, maybe you only need a few elements to make that experience. So rather than jumping right into the code, you might have like a bunch of things you're trying to make a reality. Start small.
Yeah, that's another great point. Yeah.
What does it matter what your code does if your users still doesn't understand what you just did?
Yeah. I think that's the most important point, but I'm happy to hear more. Yeah? No? Cool. Everyone's like, I got nothing. So what you intend your app to be really isn't very important, or at least it's not as important as what your user thinks your app is. Ravel and Mohammed, could you guys close your computers? Sorry, thanks. So what you intend your app to be, you too, thanks, I didn't even notice. What you intend your app to be isn't nearly as important as how the user perceives your app. So let me give you a non-coding example of what I mean. If you constantly hurt people's feelings, and I'm not saying this because, as a way of secretly saying I think someone in here is always hurting people's feelings. I just mean like if you're in a relationship and you always hurt the other person's feelings, even if you have the best intentions, your intentions don't really matter. The important thing is that you're hurting this person's feelings. No amount of good intentions is going to change that. Something about the behavior needs to change in order for their feelings to not be hurt. Another thing in business. So let's take Facebook for example. You could say Facebook has the user story of they want users should feel their data is secure. Users should feel their data is secure. Now that user story doesn't say Facebook should have code that keeps user data secure. In fact, I would say that making sure users feel their code is secure, users feel their data is secure, is much more important than Facebook actually writing the code to make sure that users' data is secure. So if me using Facebook, like if Facebook keeps on assuring me that my data is safe, then I'm probably going to believe it. I have no idea what their code looks like on the back end. I will never see Facebook's back end code. It could just be, held together with duct tape. I have no idea how secure it actually is. But as long as I continue to believe that it's secure, as long as they keep up that image, then I'm going to keep using Facebook. So what's much more important to Facebook is just keeping up that image rather than keeping their code secure. In fact, if it was more profitable to them just to pay off every hacker in the world to not hack their code, then they could just leave it totally insecure. I mean, then their code is totally insecure, but they'll still say our code's never going to be hacked, your data's always going to be safe, and they're going to keep up that image. And if it costs less, then they're going to do that. They're going to do whatever is the cheapest way possible of me continuing to think my data is safe. They're going to do whatever is the cheapest thing possible for me to think my data is safe. Same thing with user stories. Do whatever the minimum is in order for that user story to be accomplished. Whatever the minimum is in order for your user to think that it's a duck, or your user to think that the card has been flipped over, or your user to think that they're logged in. Whatever the minimum is. That's why the user story is more important. As long as your user believes the card is flipped over, how you actually flip over the card really isn't important. The code you do to make that happen really isn't important. The important thing is getting them to believe that the card is flipped over. And you can do that any number of ways. Any thoughts about that?
This is how it ties in with the game illusion, because everything in the computer is illusion anyway, so it's the same thing, approach the same way with code. This is all just lights, and it's all just like what you kind of see. So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's all just what you kind of see. So in talking about all this stuff, if I was sitting in your shoes, I would be like, man, this is some bullshit. This isn't code. This is a whole bunch of goody-goody stuff that I don't really need to know. And you may be right. Depends on what you do. But what I've consistently found is that the fuzzy things in code always end up being the most important. When you interview for a job or are working on some sort of a team, user stories are one of the very first things they'll look for. It's extremely important to your employability. Why?
Because that's at the end of the day that's what the most important thing is. That's the whole reason you're coding is to get the end user to feel that experience. I think.
Sure, but let's say I had two people interviewing for me, and I'm a hiring manager. One of them just craps out an app that works perfectly well, really, really great, and the other one just gives me some really detailed user stories. I'm probably more inclined to the person who has really good, really detailed user stories, assuming they can demonstrate that they have some proficiency. Why is that? Right?
Because it shows that you could think from a user perspective.
Yeah, that's one thing. Brendan?
I think it comes down to money, and in many cases, right? If you're building something for an end user, that's probably where you're going to generate revenue. I mean, not in everything. Obviously, you're not always going to be, it could be donations, it could be anything. But again, if the person who's using your application can't figure it out or doesn't like it, they're not going to use it anymore, and you're not going to have the results that you desire.
Yeah, that's also very true. Alex?
I mean, I think kind of along that same line, they want to see that you're trying to do it in the least complicated and least expensive way. Whereas if someone's just pouring out this app, they clearly didn't think about what's the minimum that I need to make it happen.
Yeah, that's also true. Adrian?
Well, it's we are I don't know, a race of people addicted to instant no graphics, no grandmas, no weird rocket ships, it would really, really, really suck.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
we tend to like the instant gratification of it.
It's true. Sarah?
They can kind of get a glimpse of the like thought process without it being like overcomplicated. So without them thinking too much about what your code was, they can get like an overview of what is about to kind of do without them.
Yeah.
Like
Thank you. Who else are user stories important for beyond just the end user? Mohammed?
Of the developers that come after you.
The other developers? Yeah, Adrian?
Anybody that doesn't code.
Exactly. Yeah, anybody that doesn't code. So user stories, this is why one of the most important things about user stories is that you don't put code in them. You don't even put div in them. No HTML, nothing. No code in them. That's because a user story is a way of conveying your ideas to people who don't code. So that could be your project manager. That could be your graphic designer who is just as important to your job as you are. Brendan, you talked about like the graphic designers that came from the other direction, where they had user stories that were like completely impossible or really complicated for developers. It's one of the most important things, not just for the end user, but really for every human being involved, because people don't think in code. You guys are learning a different language. You guys are basically learning Chinese to everyone else's English. It really is a different language and a different way of thinking that people don't understand. And so user stories are important to take this weird stuff and turn it into English, into something that people can really get, really understand. So I would say it's actually a lot easier to be a crack coder who can just bang out awesome code. It's a lot easier to be that person than it is to be the coder who can talk about their code, who can talk about what they're doing. As such, the more valuable coder and programmer is the one who can talk about it. I'm not just saying that because it's my job to talk about code, so I think I'm hot shit. It's because it's really more valuable to be able to talk about code. In the same way that, those of you who went to college, you probably had professors who were brilliant in their field and taught like crap. So brilliant mathematician or whatever, and was terrible at teaching. And that's not really what you want as a student or as a teammate or as a project manager. You don't want someone who can't talk, who can't articulate this stuff. So getting really good at something, usually it's just sort of a matter of time. Being able to talk well about something, being articulate about it, that takes much more thought. So, yeah, I think that's sort of enough soapboxing for me for now. Any thoughts about all this stuff? It's all right.
You're basically describing like my job before I came here.
Oh, yeah?
Years, because I was in sales and I worked with PMs, designers, front-end, back-end
Sales.
developers. Yep, it was terrible. But talking to clients, that's what they care about.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them are marketing people, in consulting, they're marketing people and they don't know anything about code. They don't care about that.
Yeah.
Just care about the result.
Yeah, fair point. One last thing I'll say is that, again, I really don't like this fuzzy stuff. And I mean, example A of that is when I was doing that, bronze, silver, and gold thing, and, I put in that sort of addendum to it where I was talking about how, I just sort of, sat down and was, just banging through the gold part of it, and I was like, yeah, I got this. And it ended up being this, 300-line Leviathan that was, I guess, object-oriented, but impossible to read. And that was because I thought I was too good to do bronze, silver, and gold. When I went back and I actually wrote down the bronze, silver, and gold, I turned out something that was much more readable and much better, just in every possible way. So you're never going to be immune from this stuff. One of the most frustrating things to me is that, any time I encounter doing something fuzzy in programming, it makes me a better programmer. I wish it would stop because then I could just focus on doing code and I wouldn't have to worry about all this fuzzy stuff. But the reality is the fuzzy stuff is really, really important and makes you a lot better. I wish it didn't, but it does. So it's just one of those things. What I'd like to do next is I would like to actually write out my own user stories for the concentration game. So for the memory game that you guys did in Project 1. And so the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to start off with, the actual user stories, and then I'm going to gradually transition it from being user-ish to code-ish. Okay?
You mean like pseudocode? You go from user story to pseudocode to actual code?
Yes. Yep. And that's the way to do it, is to write user code first, then pseudocode, then actual code, in that order. And I should say too that this is like kind of a difficult thing while we're writing really tiny apps. Like PixArt or like Final Countdown, all these little things where it just feels like a lot of unnecessary work to write user stories for them. And there's no doubt in my mind that you can make your app work perfectly fine without needing to do user stories. But, I mean, we're here to practice, so I would really strongly encourage you to sort of, get over your I don't know, whatever you want to call it, in the same way that I had to get over my own, like, bronze, silver, gold thing, and force yourself to write these user stories, even if it seems like bleh, because that's something that you're going to be expected to do later on. And it can be kind of fun, as we'll talk more about later on. So, for concentration, to begin with, I'm just going to write down the rules as I remember them. So, when the user begins a game, the cards are face down. Other rules. The user can turn over cards. If two cards are face up and they match, the user leaves them face up. If two cards are face down and they don't match, if two cards are face up and they don't match, the user turns them face down. And I think that's pretty much it for the game. I mean, there's stuff about like how to lay out the cards and shuffling the deck, but I'm not going to get to that right now. I'm just going to start off assuming I have a shuffled deck. Yeah, right?
Wouldn't the user also expect that if all the cards are face up, that they won the game?
Oh, yeah, good point. So if all cards are face up, the user has won the game.
This kind of feels like pseudocode in a way.
Yeah, and that's probably because just like it's hard for me to not write pseudocode, but there's nothing about code in here, like in my defense.
Like when we were learning how to write pseudocode, we did the thing with the instructions on how to make like, peanut butter and jelly, and it's kind of like that's like the beginning stages, which I guess it is. Beginning stages.
I mean, to my mind, it's like, that's one thing about card games. I was actually having this conversation with Jeff in the other room, and he was talking about how when he was starting this, he was hoping to see more of that like separation of reality and computer stuff, and he was hoping for it to feel a bit different. He was doing war, and then he was like, well, no, here I am dealing out cards. Here I am, shuffling a deck. It actually felt like real life. That's one thing about card games is that card games have very, very clearly defined rules, very clear parameters. So card games really are a lot like computer programs in a lot of ways. But they're different enough. I'm pretty happy as long as the user story doesn't contain anything about code. If is not considered code. That's like plain old English. So as long as it can be read as plain old English, I think it's perfectly fine.
But would it help if you said something like, as a user, I want my cards to be facing down? Or, like as a product owner, I want this and this so that I can do this and this.
Yeah, that's another thing about user stories. I don't really like to write my user stories that way. If I wanted to, I could do like, as a user, when I begin a game, blah, blah, blah. As a user, I can turn over cards. As a user, if two cards are face up, I could just write as a user in front of all of these. But partially just to save real estate on the screen, and partially because I'm lazy and a hypocrite, I'm not going to. Okay, so I have my user stories. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to look through these for basically every noun and every verb, and I'm going to write those out. So that would be begins a game, card, face down, adjectives too, I guess. Face up, turn over, let's see, match, and let's see.
User?
Oh, yeah, user, good point. Leaves them, yeah, won the game. All right, so now I have all of these. These basically describe all of the different pieces of code I need to write, all the different components of my app. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to translate these into pseudocode. So begins the game. This could happen any number of different ways. I'm just going to say when the page loads. That's beginning the game. I could have like a button, but for right now, I'm just going to do when the page loads. What's next? Card. I'm just going to say that is a div. Face down, that means the div has no text. the div has text. Turn over, that means the div is clicked. Match is two divs have the same text. The user, I can sort of leave that as is. The user is the user. Leaves them, that means like nothing happens, basically. And then the last thing, won the game, notified, the user notified won the game.
All the cards match.
Sorry?
All the cards match? Or
Oh, like
they're
if-
all flipped up?
Yeah, I already sort of have that. If all cards are, I already have face up defined, and I already have cards defined, so I think I'm good for that.
So here you're not saying like what needs to happen in the order. You're saying all the things that throughout the game you will need to like call, like face down, will happen multiple times.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I'm basically defining all of the different things in my app and all the different states that they can have, if you will. You're right, I don't have don't match in here, so don't match two divs have different text. Okay, so now that I've done this, now I'm going to start turning this into actual pseudocode. I would say code stories. For my user stories, now I'm going to write code stories. Calling it code stories because I still want it to sort of flow like English. So I'm going to start putting these things together. I'm going to say, let's see. Well, a couple tips to keep in mind. One thing is that if your code is nothing happens, then that's code you don't need to write. That's a code story you don't need to write because there is no code for nothing happens. You just don't write the code. There's no code for it. So if you have a nothing happens, you can just sort of leave that alone. The other thing to keep in mind is if you have something go from like has text to has no text, then it, like my first thought would be to delete the text. But deleting stuff and then placing it back again is really kind of complicated in programming. It's really expensive. It's the same thing with click listeners. Like, I know a lot of you wanted it to be like, you know, they can't click the card if it's already face up. And so a lot of people are looking to remove event listener, which is one way to do it, but that's a lot of work. You have to remove all the event listeners and then you have to put them all back. Instead, what's a lot simpler is just like if you want to switch between no text and it has text, just change the color of it. Change the color of the text from transparent to black and back again. Or change the opacity from 0 to 1 and back again. Or display none to display block and back again. Lots of different ways to fake it. Yeah, Mohammed?
I saw a lot of some of the memory games that had that, where you could like, you know, highlight when you highlighted it with like your mouse or whatever, then you could just see all the texts.
Yeah.
Whether it was hidden or not.
But you know what? It's a balance. I mean, the duck definitely wasn't a duck. It was something that looked vaguely duck-like. So what's more important? Is it important to actually have the text not there? Or is it just important that it be hidden at that particular point? I mean, a lot of people also had, like, the answer for all the trivia questions was hard-coded into the HTML. It was just hidden. So anyone looking at that could see all the answers if they just look at the source code. Is that okay? Depends on the thing. With Cookie Clicker, I can hack it so that it clicks once every millisecond. Is that okay? Yeah, it doesn't really detract from my user experience. So it's always sort of a trade-off. So I'm going to take this and then do, let's see. When the user loads the page, so I've got when the user begins a game, when the user loads the page, the text on all divs is hidden. The next thing is the user can turn over cards. If the user clicks on a div, its text is shown. If the user clicks on a div with a hidden value, the value is shown. So that sort of contradicts this one up here. This one isn't really accurate. I only want the text to be shown if it's hidden right now. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that one. If the user clicks on a div with shown text, nothing happens. So this is another line I can remove. It's got nothing happens in it. and I just don't need to write any code for nothing happens. I can safely remove this line. So the last thing is if two cards are face up and they match, the user leaves them face up. If two cards are face up and they don't match, the user turns them face down. So that's another nothing happens. I can condense this to if the values of two divs are revealed and their values are not the same, their values are hidden. Okay, and then the last step in this, and I know you're probably like, dude, what at this point? And I'll talk about that in a second too. The last thing is to take this and turn it, I would say this is a code story. Now I'm gonna turn it into pseudocode. And so when I say pseudocode, I mean code where one line translates really neatly into actual code. So I'm gonna do when the user loads the page, the values on all divs are hidden. When a div is clicked, if its value is hidden, its value is revealed. If another div is already revealed, if the other revealed div has a different value, both revealed divs values are hidden. And that's it. So this is my pseudocode for writing the memory game. And if this all translates pretty neatly into actual code. For instance, when the user loads the page, window on load, the values in all divs are hidden. So I could do divs for each and then hide each one. When a div is clicked, div add event listener, and so on. So first I'm going to tell you what you're going to do next, and then I'm going to work back into it and explain something else. So what I'm going to ask you to do next is to do user stories for Final Countdown, which you may have started, you may not have started. But before we do that, there are two things. One is I've created a list of words in English that translate really nicely into words in code. And this is on the lesson plan. So if I write when, usually that means I want to add an event listener. Or here I did onload. If I do if, it's probably an if. If I do otherwise, it's probably an else. If I do nothing happens, it's probably nothing. So this isn't like, this isn't hard and fast. Take this with a grain of salt. There are an infinite number of ways to show and hide stuff beyond just display none and display block. But this is one way. So there's that. The other thing is that you guys are probably, maybe you're not, I don't know, but are probably feeling like Robin just blew through that thing and now he's asking me to write user stories. That's kind of BS. So one thing I want to talk about is this. You might feel a little bit like this. Yeah, I love this thing. So quick story time with Uncle Robin. When I was running my business, selling that little folding dry erase board, I had a lot of people from all over the world saying, hey, I want one of these things. Can you send one to me in Australia, Canada, whatever? And I was like, sure. And I had this sort of vague idea that I would need to look into taxes and tariffs and all that stuff. So I started looking into the rules for sending something overseas, for exporting something to another country. And I couldn't find the rules anywhere. And I looked and I looked and I looked and I couldn't find anything. And so because I was really paranoid about the IRS banging down my door, I ended up just saying, sorry guys, I'm not going to ship anything overseas. And so as a result, I lost out on a lot of business. Eventually, I realized that the reason I couldn't find any rules was because there weren't any. I thought that, there had to be rules for some guy sending a little $10 product overseas. Turns out there aren't really any rules unless you're sending over $10,000 worth of stuff. I didn't know that. I assumed an absence of rules meant that I was just looking in the wrong place. I was reading the wrong thing. With user stories, and with pretty much everything in code, it can kind of feel like you're being expected to go from drawing circles to drawing the rest of the fucking owl. But the reality is, there isn't an owl, especially with user stories. There isn't a right way to do it. There isn't like something you're expected to achieve. Every person you talk to is going to have a different way of doing it. And that's true in a frustrating number of things in code. It would be a lot easier if there was a right way to do things, but there's not. All we can tell you is what we think is like what works best for us and what we've seen work well for other people. But ultimately, how you do it is up to you. How you get from the circles to the owl is up to you. It's really your own owl. You define the owl, and you get to that point. So when I ask you to do these user stories in a second, really it's just all about exploring it and figuring out how it works best for you. Force yourselves to do it, especially if you're one of those people who thinks that like you don't really need to do the fuzzy stuff like I am. Force yourself to do it because it's really important. But how you do it, that's really up to you. The important thing is just to do it. Aaron, do you have something? Okay, I thought I saw your hand. Any thoughts about that? Any questions or anything?
I guess the question is kind of like the way we write our user stories in pseudocode kind of translate to how we're code it. So we're kind of writing a pseudocode in a weird way of how we're approaching it, and it's kind of showing the code eventually when we actually do it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, I guess getting better at practicing what works for you and make sure you're doing right some code and how your user stories translate to the right code to build it the right way in a similar way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely correct. Anything else?
That's like every home design.
Yeah, right. But you know, for a lot of them, there's not really a right way to do the owl. Like for instance, a final countdown, it says that you should end up with a class called fail that makes the text turn red. I don't really care if it's called fail. It can be called, whatever you want. That doesn't really matter to me. In fact, whether or not you finish, that doesn't really matter to me. The important thing is just that you try it. But on that note, so it says 20 minutes here, but I'm going to give you guys, I'll give you half an hour to work on the user stories for this so that you can take a good 10-minute break somewhere in there. And then I'm going to ask that you work with the people around you, so the people at your table, to come up with these user stories. And also, let's see. So working on the user stories, I would also say, if you can avoid it, don't write it on a computer. Just write it on a whiteboard with a dry erase marker or on your table. Also, if you finish your user stories, don't progress to code on your computer. Instead, write the code on paper. That's because in like every interview you have, you're going to be asked to code on a whiteboard or code on paper, and it is hard, man, no matter how good you are. We've already experienced that with slips. You might do stuff that you think you know like the back of your hand, but as soon as you don't have a computer to do it on, totally different ballgame. So you're going to start off with user stories, then go to code stories, then go to pseudocode, and then go to code on paper. And that's what I'd like you to do over the next half hour with the people around you. Any questions about that? Slip? That's what we did this morning, where we project the questions up on the board. Yep. All right, I'll set the timer for half an hour. You guys can go right ahead.
Which one? Yeah.